The Industrial Revolution will fundamentally change the way people live. It changes life. In order to maximize, like factories, have people now, you have the work, the economics, the economic forces of society are no longer in the cottage industry. They're no longer in people's homes. They're no longer dominated by more private sort of business locations, if you will. Instead, you now have the large scale element of the economy really being driven by factories. Factories which are external, large employment enterprises that mass produce products. And as a result of that, work is now pushed from the home, if you will, particularly with the textiles, into the public sector. People have to leave home to go to work. And of course, that, again, very much shapes the construct, the false construct of gender inequality, which is very much present during the Industrial Revolution. But to maximize productivity and profit, factories are centered around production. And the more productivity you generally have, the greater the profit to the factory owners. And to maximize productivity and profit, workers now have to follow very specific set times. You have work shifts, time clocks that you have to keep. Your work, too, is more mundane, and it's often more dangerous. So you might be working in a factory that has lots of textile machines going, and the actual labor you're doing is probably loud. It's probably got lots and lots of particulate matter being thrown up in the air, which you're breathing in, which causes a health effect. And the machines are very crammed together. And as a result of this, the work is more dangerous, but it's also probably more mundane because the worker is effectively monitoring and overseeing the machine as opposed to doing the work themselves. And so the work tends to be more mundane. And when you're using machines that could be very dangerous and it's loud, chaotic, maybe chaotic's the wrong word, but it's loud, there's all this stuff going on, things are cramped together, the work is mundane, but you have these dangerous machines going on, it can also be very dangerous. And of course, workers who are unskilled workers, and in the factories, most of the workers in a steel mill or in a textile factory, these workers are generally unskilled workers. Somebody else can be trained to do their job relatively quickly. And as a result of this, without governments being present to pass laws that protect workers' rights to collectively bargain, pass laws to protect workers' wages, to protect laws to protect working conditions, and to also pass laws to prevent employers from effectively using actions to threaten or repress workers who are seeking to collectively bargain. If you don't have that, an unskilled worker really has no ability to alter this reality in a meaningful sense, with the exception of some very few individuals that are able to break out of this and achieve within this society. So you have dangerous work where there is no, workers and governments have not been able to achieve things like unemployment benefits or disability benefits or workman's compensation or retirements or Social Security or health care. These types of things are not, let alone a living wage type of job, these things are not often the case in large-scale manufacturing when you have unskilled workers that are really the bulk of the economic enterprise. So work is dangerous. Workers have very little in the way of safety nets or legal recourse. They're very regimented on time shifts and time clocks. The presence of clocks becomes ubiquitous as society becomes organized around the productivity of business and economics. Workers have to follow very strict guidelines as well. And this shapes the way people live. It shapes the nature of work. It also shapes culture more deeply. You have the concept increasingly in society, the concept of sin is often lacking virtue, is often associated increasingly with people that are regarded as lazy or wasteful. Being a thrifty, hard-nosed businessman who makes a lot of money is increasingly seen as a sign of virtue during this period of time. Discipline becomes really an inherent approach in many circles of religion during the time period. Many come to make the sort of argument that hardship today, thrift, discipline, hard work today results in the benefits in heaven, in the afterlife. Deeply affects culture. Women, too, are increasingly encouraged to be domestic. And so this is where we see the Industrial Revolution sort of drive apart that fallacy of gender inequality, where increasingly women are encouraged to be domestic, to be in the home, to get married, to have kids, and to effectively care for the home and be cared for economically by the man. And this, of course, creates the roots of systemic gender inequality and discrimination in the world that still exists into the 21st century. In the 1800s, locomotion in world history, when we study world history, we're studying the forces of global interconnectivity, particularly the forces of the interconnections of the world and how those shared interconnections drive change. We see in the Industrial Revolution, with these new forms of locomotion, we see a world increasingly interconnected at a pace unthought of before. And the changes as a result of this are profound. Locomotion of the 1800s is driven by railroads and steamships, powered by now much more advanced steam engines. And a steam engine uses a fossil fuel, coal. Early steam engines use wood sometimes, but coal burns much hotter, and it's more effective. And the way a steam engine works is you basically have a boiler, you have fire that's burning coal, and the fire heats a boiler that has water in it. The water creates steam, which creates pressure, and that pressure is then used, it's released in calculated points to power pistons that are on the outside of the steam engine. And that then powers, in this case, the train's wheels along these tracks. Railroads and steamships. The steam engine was first applied to a locomotive, a train, in 1804 by Richard Trevithick. It was in the early 1800s, it was really like the railroad was kind of like a scientific curiosity in the early 1800s. George Stephenson, for example, built his rocket in 1829 and it went a whole 16 miles an hour. I'm pretty sure that the famous Olympic sprinter Usain Bolt could run faster than that, or close to at least. By the mid 1800s, you will see the railroad really become an efficient and commonplace element of locomotion, interconnecting places like the continental United States. In the United States in 1869, the first Continental Railroad was completed, the Golden Spike as it's called, in Ogden, Utah. And this was development that was owed much to not only the advancing of the steam engine itself, but also to the rail technology, the tracks that the locomotives would be traveling on. Initially, in the early 1800s, they were built of like wood with like a little iron plank on top of it. And then they were built of iron, but iron is brittle. It will break. And so it wasn't until the 1850s with the development of what is called the Bessemer process, where you saw the mass production of steel become possible. And steel was needed to create really safe and effective railroad tracks. And so it's by the 1850s, 1860s, you start to see railroads really become a dominant force interconnecting continental regions both in places like the United States and also built in the now increasing colonial territories in places like Africa, as the British and the French particularly begin to colonize, forcefully colonize the continent of Africa and other parts of the world. These are fueling the scale and the speed of the process of globalization. We're talking about an escalation of globalization driven by technologies. Here you see an early 20th century steam vessel. This, of course, is a highly advanced steam vessel, as is this a highly advanced later 1800s locomotive. But these technologies drive globalization. They drive the exchange of people, of ideas, of technology throughout the world. They also drive conquest and colonization during the age of imperialism as well. Facilitates the age of the high imperialism as European powers are able to use these technologies to increasingly, as the United States does, as also by the turn of the 20th century, to increasingly establish colonies and to conquer peoples in the developing worlds who are then exploited by Western European economic and military powers. But we see, as a result of this, an increasingly interconnected world where people start consuming Argentine beef, where African diamonds becomes a staple of the symbol of marriage, where Chilean copper is being used increasingly in the new technologies of the days, and U.S. cotton being grown by slaves in the American South is coming to be the dominant force in the global textile industry as the United States careens towards the devastating American Civil War. The Industrial Revolution in the United States, 1800 to 1860, was really when you start to see a really rapid industrialization. Increasingly, people start to move from the country to the cities, albeit there's not a shift in terms of urban to countryside until 1920s. It's not until the 1920s where you see more people living in cities than in the countryside in the United States. But you see this process really developing throughout the 1800s. And in the United States, of course, the industrial center was the Northeast, particularly in New England, New York, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Jersey, are really at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. The first textile mill in the United States was Samuel Slater's mill, which was built in Rhode Island in 1790. And again, it was built largely using what might be called industrial espionage, as Slater had come to Rhode Island from the United Kingdom, and he had memorized the machines and the organization of the factories, and he had used this to create Samuel Slater's mill in Rhode Island, which was built on the river in Rhode Island. It used water power initially. It employed factory girls who lived basically on site at Slater's mill and who lived nearby at Slater's mill and who worked the machines in this textile mill in the early period of the United States. Above you see Robert Fulton's Claremont, and this was a revolution in steamboat technology, 1807. And Robert Fulton, who was who practiced in many different activities, he was an artist as well, would ultimately apply his ingenuity to develop an efficient use steamboat that interconnected the United States. And at this time, in 1807, the United States is really from the Mississippi River to the east. There is no real interconnection of the far-flung western territories yet, and many of those are not possessed by the United States yet. They are territories of Spain and then Mexico, of course. And of course, the Louisiana territory was only just being explored by Lewis and Clark and other explorers. But that area of the United States, from the Mississippi River to the East Coast, to the Atlantic, is increasingly being interconnected by canals. Canals like the Erie Canal and other types of canal systems that connect the Ohio River to the Mississippi and the Great Lakes, ultimately to the Hudson River and to New York City. And it was steamboats that really fueled the sort of interconnection of the early United States in the early portion of the 1800s, with ultimately railroads becoming a dominant force of interconnection, traffic, and trade continentally for the United States by the mid 1800s, with the first continental line being completed in Ogden, Utah, in the United States in 1869.